The year is 55 BC. Julius Caesar stands on the shores of northern Gaul, what we today know as northern France. For the past 4 years, Caesar has been waging military campaigns that brought him from the north of Italy to the English Channel. Caesar was a notoriously ambitious man. From a young age, he was determined to be first wherever he was. First in rank, first in preeminence, first in honor, glory, and accomplishment. We are told that once, as Caesar was crossing the Alps and passing by a barbarian village, which had very few inhabitants and was a sorry sight, his companions asked with mirth and laughter, "Can it be that here too there are ambitious strifes for office, struggles for primacy, and mutual jealousies of powerful men?" But Caesar said to them in all seriousness, "I would rather be first here than second at Rome." This principle would dominate every aspect of Caesar's life. And it would be no less true in 55 BC, when Caesar stood on what seemed like the edge of the known world. There were rumors that out there beyond the horizon there was a great island, but little was known about it. The island which we today know as Great Britain was almost mythical to the Romans. Some said that it didn't even exist, but Caesar knew that it did exist. During Caesar's wars in Gaul, men had come from that mysterious island to carry on trade and to fight. In fact, this was Caesar's official reason for why he wanted to set sail out into the unknown, where few men had gone before, and invade this troublesome and mythical island. The Britons had sent warriors to Europe in order to reinforce Caesar's enemies, and Caesar intended to put a stop to their meddling by any means necessary. Indeed, Caesar had a penchant for the theatrical, for over-the-top displays. In July of 55 BC, a month before his invasion of Britain, Caesar had his army construct an unprecedented bridge across the river Rhine in just 10 days, and then tore it down again a couple of weeks later, just to send a message that he could strike anywhere he wanted, across any obstacle, and no person or place was out of his reach. Caesar's next feat would be to launch a similarly unprecedented amphibious assault on an unknown land, in the name of taking Roman supremacy still farther than any Roman had ever gone before. Of course, invading a land that is practically unknown is both incredibly daring and also extremely hazardous, and Caesar's invasion would encounter more than its fair share of calamities, but such calamities would prove to be the canvas on which Caesar would sketch his immortal image. His charisma, quick thinking, and improvisation, combined with his sheer audacity in the invasion of Britain, would solidify his reputation as one of the greatest military commanders in all of history. Not only would this risky expedition boost his political reputation in Rome, but it would satisfy his incessant craving to be preeminent. He would be the first Roman commander to set foot in Britain, and he would be one step closer to being the first man in Rome itself. So, in late August of 55 BC, Caesar assembled his forces in the territory of the Morini. When preparations for the invasion had been made and the weather was good, Caesar finally gave the order on a warm summer evening. They would set sail just after midnight. Caesar's invasion force consisted of several warships, as well as 80 transport ships that would carry 2 legions, the 7th and the elite 10th Legion, in addition to 18 transport ships that would carry cavalry. This invasion force sailed slowly through the English Channel through the night, and as daylight began to grow in the east, Caesar would have come within sight of the famous White Cliffs of Dover sometime after 8 a.m., and what he saw there must have been impressive, because there in the breaking morning light, lined up all along the tops of the cliffs, were men and chariots ready for battle. The Britons had gotten wind of Caesar's planned invasion, and they were ready for him. Caesar immediately saw that this was not a good place to disembark. Had they attempted to land there, the enemy could throw down weapons, darts, and rocks on the narrow beach. So for the time being, Caesar gave the order to drop anchor, and he remained offshore until about 2:30 in the afternoon, waiting until the rest of the invasion force arrived in full. At which point, Caesar assembled his lieutenants and military tribunes, and he gave them very specific orders about what they were going to do. And he made it clear that everything he ordered was to be done immediately, at a nod, and at an instant. Speed was imperative. If they were going to pull off this landing, they needed to be at their sharpest, mentally focused, and ready to act quickly, and ready to react to any change in circumstance. After dismissing his officers to their positions, Caesar gave the signal for the fleet to sail 7 miles around the cliffs to a place where there was a flat beach where the Romans would hopefully have a better chance at a fight. This maneuver, of course, did not go unnoticed by the Britons. From atop the cliffs, they could see every move that Caesar's fleet was making. With their horsemen and chariots, the Britons shadowed the Roman fleet along the coast and intercepted them at the place where Caesar had intended to land. And this simple tactic would turn out to be a major problem for the Romans. Firstly, the hulls of the Roman ships were so big that they could only be stationed in deep water, and they could not be drawn up onto the beach. This meant that Caesar's troops would have to jump into relatively deep water and try to make their way to the shore, which meant trying to swim while firstly being weighed down by armor and carrying weapons and a heavy shield, not to mention that they had to struggle in against the force of the waves and the current, all while they were being attacked from shore by the enemy, who had the advantage of being on dry ground, or even of at times advancing a little into the water, guiding their horses into the shallows, and throwing various weapons at the Roman soldiers. And because of these challenges, Caesar somewhat shamefully states that, dismayed by these circumstances and altogether untrained in this mode of battle, our men did not all exert the same vigor and earnestness which they had been accustomed to exerting in engagements on dry ground. In other words, the Roman soldiers were uncharacteristically frightened. Many of them just would not get out of the ships, and they refused to jump into the sea and attempt an attack. But this all would change when 2 things happened. First, Caesar had the wherewithal to order a flanking move, to try and get pressure off of his foot soldiers. He ordered his warships to go around the barbarians' open flank on the Roman left. These ships began using ballistic engines and launching slings and arrows, and the Britons took Caesar's bait. They started chasing the warships, yet still, even with this distraction, Caesar's men hesitated. Ultimately, it would not be Caesar himself who impelled his men to jump from their boats and make the attack, but rather the attack would be saved by a single foot soldier, who took the initiative to act alone and swung the rest of the army into risking their lives in the swirling waters. This man was the eagle-bearer for the 10th Legion. Caesar tells us that this man, after supplicating the gods that the battle would turn out favorably to the legion, exclaimed, "Leap, fellow soldiers, unless you wish to betray your eagle to the enemy. I, for my part, will perform my duty to the Republic and my general." When he had said this with a loud voice, he leaped from the ship, and wading through the water, he proceeded to bear the eagle toward the enemy. The legionary eagle was a standard that identified and organized a legion, and not only was it enormously important, but it had tremendous symbolic value. It was the most important possession of the legion, and if it was lost in battle, the whole legion would be disgraced. Thus, when the eagle-bearer leapt out of the ship, his fellow soldiers threw their fears aside and were quick to follow him. And the effect was contagious. When those in the nearest vessels saw them, they speedily followed and approached the enemy. The fighting on the beach was fierce, and at first, neither side made any progress. The Roman fighting force, which, under normal circumstances, functioned as a well-oiled machine, organized and deadly, in this foreign environment, thrown into disarray. The pounding waves meant that soldiers could not keep ranks, nor even get a solid footing, nor could individual soldiers find the standards to their units. So units became mixed up. it became difficult to follow orders, and in Caesar's own words, there was a tremendous amount of confusion. The Britons, on the other hand, knew the land and the shallows very well. When they saw Roman soldiers disembarking one by one from their transport ships, the Britons did not hesitate. They spurred their horses into the shallows, knowing exactly where their horses could go, and they attacked the Roman troops in their hampered state, either surrounding small groups of isolated Romans or attacking the Roman right flank, which was now unprotected and particularly vulnerable, since Romans carried their shields on their left. The Britons threw weapons indiscriminately into the mass of Roman troops trying to consolidate toward the beach. When Caesar saw this, he ordered his smaller boats to be filled with troops. These boats were typically used for support and reconnaissance and didn't have the ramming beak of a warship, which meant that they could navigate in further to the shore and help Roman units that were in distress. Presumably, the men in the small boats would have either launched javelins called pilae at the barbarians, or they would have actually leapt out of the boats to engage in hand-to-hand combat on better ground. Caesar was inventing new tactics in the very lightning-quick moments that problems presented themselves, and this kind of ability to know the right thing to do in an instant is part of that X factor, that unteachable element that goes into making a true military genius. These rudimentary auxiliary tactics proved to be just enough to tip the balance of the battle. When the Romans were able to finally reach the beach and had a solid footing on dry land, they were able to act and charge as a concerted force, and almost immediately, the Britons were put to flight, and the beaches belonged to Caesar. While this might seem like a win, it was not a true and complete victory, because even though the barbarian army had fled, the Romans were not actually able to pursue them and crush them, since the ships carrying the Roman cavalry had not been able to stay on course and reach the island. So Caesar had no mounted troops, and since the Roman foot soldiers had no chance of pursuing the Britons who had horses and chariots, Caesar was not able to cripple their army. Thus, the barbarian retreat was really more akin to a strategic withdrawal, regrouping to fight another day. And Caesar knew that soon there would be yet another battle to fight. Still, Julius Caesar had successfully landed and established himself in Britain. When the barbarian army had recovered from their retreat, they immediately sent ambassadors to Caesar to ask for peace. And peace was successfully established. Caesar had not come to Britain to conquer it, at least not on this occasion. With only 2 legions at his disposal, and winter fast approaching, Caesar had neither the time nor the resources for another lengthy military campaign to subjugate an entire island. Rather, this expedition was more akin to a scouting mission. Caesar would gather all the intelligence he could, and then return to Gaul for the winter. But 2 things would happen that would ruin Caesar's plans, and guarantee that there would be more fighting with the Britons. First, the transports that had been carrying Caesar's cavalry, and which had strayed off course, would ultimately get caught in a storm, and would never arrive at Caesar's location, a fact that would be important later. The second thing that happened was the full moon, which occurred a handful of days after the initial battle on the beach. You see, in the English Channel, there is a phenomenon which occurs during the full moon called a spring tide, in which the level of the water along the coast seems to spring forth drastically, as tides rise much higher than usual. This phenomenon occurs in most coastal areas around the world, except in the Mediterranean, which experiences tides that are so small they are barely noticeable. Thus, Caesar and his men were almost completely ignorant about the way ocean tides worked, since their knowledge of sailing came completely from the Mediterranean environment. By the time the full moon occurred, Caesar had had his warships drawn up onto the beaches of Britain while leaving his cargo ships out at anchor. And it just so happened that on the very night of the full moon, there was another fierce storm. This catastrophic combination ruined Caesar's fleet. The cargo ships out at anchor were battered, several were completely broken up, and the rest lost ropes, anchors, and tackle, rendering them unseaworthy. As for the warships on the beach, they were completely swamped by the rising tide. This meant that for the time being, Caesar was effectively stranded in Britain. Since Caesar had planned to return to Gaul for the winter, he had brought no grain supplies with him, and without any cargo ships, no supplies could be delivered from the continent. If a solution to this supply problem was not quickly found, the Roman army faced starvation. Unsurprisingly, Caesar says that there was great distress among the army. For the Britons, however, all of this was a turn in their favor. When they discovered that the Romans had no cavalry or ships or grain, and that the Roman army was in fact actually much smaller than they had initially thought, they decided that the best plan of action was to launch another attack. If they could defeat the Romans now, in their weakened state, then they would be the ones sending a message to the rest of the world, or at least to anyone who thought of trying to invade their island. A message not to come to Britain with the purpose of making war. Anyone who did so would face disaster. When the chiefs had all agreed to this course of action, they immediately began calling men in from their farms and reassembling their army. Of course, Caesar knew nothing of the barbarian plans as yet, but he nevertheless suspected that, given his now vulnerable position, the Britons were likely to try and attack him again. He therefore began immediately to make preparations for another conflict. In his words, he provided remedies against all contingencies. Every day he had grain collected from the fields around the Roman position and brought into the camp, thus helping to mitigate the problem of sustenance. At the same time, Caesar began salvaging wood and metal from the most damaged of his ships, so they could be used to make the more intact ships seaworthy. With the few ships that could be sailed, messengers were sent back to Gaul in order to get supplies for further repairs. The Roman soldiers themselves were the ones who enacted the repairs on their ships, acting with the greatest energy and zeal, so that even though 12 ships had been completely lost, the rest were sufficiently repaired so that the army could return. This remains an incredible testimony to the abilities of the Roman soldier. Not only was he a well-trained and formidable fighting man, effective and deadly, loyal and daring, but he was also a farmer when necessary, as well as a craftsman who could build and repair ships. As long as they had engineers who could provide instructions, patterns, and dimensions, the soldiers themselves had the knowledge to do everything that they needed to do. They could construct entire fleets. It's thanks to these capabilities that Caesar's expedition to Britain was saved from being a complete catastrophe. However, while the situation was improving, not everything was to continue going so smoothly for the Roman army. While these things were being transacted, one legion, the 7th, had been sent to forage, according to its custom, and no hint of war had arisen as yet, and some of the people remained in the country parts. Others went backward and forward to the camp. They who were on duty at the gates of the camp reported to Caesar that a greater dust than usual was seen in that direction in which the legion had just marched. Caesar suspected that this cloud of dust in the sky was a result of some new barbarian plan. There was no time to waste. Refusing to wait for his entire army to get ready for battle, Caesar instead took the 2 cohorts that were on duty and already ready for action and ordered them to march with him immediately to the spot where trouble was brewing. The rest of the army was ordered to follow them as quickly as they could once they were equipped and ready to go. After marching some distance from his camp, Caesar finally saw what the commotion was. The men of the 7th Legion who had been collecting grain were under attack. What's more, they were just barely holding out. Upon seeing the situation, Caesar quickly understood what had happened. The Britons had laid a trap. Since the Romans had been harvesting grain from all of the other areas around the Roman camp, and only this one spot remained, The enemy had expected that the Romans would come to this spot on this day to harvest the remaining grain. Accordingly, the Britons had hidden themselves in the surrounding woods during the night. Then, when the Roman legionaries arrived in the fields that morning and put their weapons down and were scattered around, each man doing his own work to harvest the grain, the Britons attacked them suddenly, surrounding them with cavalry and chariots, taking the legionaries by surprise, killing a few of them and throwing the rest into confusion. Caesar describes in his commentaries the extraordinary way in which the Britons fought using chariots. They drive all over the battlefield in all directions, and throw their weapons and generally break the ranks of the enemy with the very dread of their horses and the noise of their wheels. And when they have inserted themselves in between their cavalry squadrons, they leap from their chariots and fight on foot. The charioteers, in the meantime, withdraw some little distance from the battle, and so position themselves with the chariots that if their masters are overpowered by the number of the enemy, they may have a ready retreat to their own troops. Thus they display in battle the speed of horse together with the firmness of infantry, and by daily practice and exercise attain to such expertness that they are accustomed even on a declining and steep slope to rein in their horses at full speed and turn them on a dot, and run along the chariot pole and stand on the yoke, and thence betake themselves with the greatest celerity to their chariots again. Caesar is basically describing a form of military acrobatics, in which Britons would run alongside their horses and leap onto the yoke and then back into the chariot in order to get out of combat. Under these circumstances, it's no surprise that Caesar says his men were dismayed and disturbed by seeing and experiencing these things in the chaos of battle. The general had arrived just in time, and when the enemy saw him and his reinforcements, they paused, giving the stunned Roman troops enough time to get over their initial fear and disorientation. Rather than engaging in a pitched battle, however, Caesar, who preferred to give his troops time to rest and recover physically and emotionally, especially after experiencing a setback, simply established his position and gave his legions an opportunity to safely withdraw back to camp. It was basically a simple rescue mission. For the next several days, there were more storms without a break. This prevented the Romans from going out to work and confined them within the walls of their camp. While it also prevented the barbarians from attacking, the Britons made sure to put the time to good use. They dispatched messengers to every part of their land, who rode through the downpouring storms and reported to their people how small the Roman army was and convinced them that this was a great opportunity to plunder the Romans and liberate themselves forever by expelling this invading force. By the time the weather had cleared, the Britons had assembled an even larger force of infantry and cavalry, including the dreaded chariots. The time for battle had come, and Caesar responded by deploying his legions in battle formation in front of the Roman camp. His description of the ensuing engagement is short and sweet. When the action commenced, the enemy were able to withstand the attack of our men only briefly, before they turned their backs and fled. In a supremely anticlimactic turn, the Britons were routed. They were still no match for the Roman army when it was fully organized. But unlike on previous occasions, when the enemy had gotten away to fight another day, Caesar had by this time obtained 30 horsemen from the continent. These horsemen pursued the Britons as far as their speed and strength permitted, and slew a great number of them. Then, having destroyed and burned everything far and wide, they returned to their camp. This must be an incredible testament to the effect that just 30 skilled horsemen can achieve, both in a rout and in scorched earth tactics. On the very same day as the battle, the Britons sent ambassadors to Caesar to again negotiate peace, and Caesar would again agree, this time doubling the number of hostages he had demanded before, and he ordered them to be brought back with him to Gaul. Winter was approaching, and Caesar didn't plan on staying in Britain any longer than he had to. The moment they had favorable weather, The Romans set sail, again a little after midnight, and arrived safely back in Gaul, all except for 2 ships, which, driven off course, were unable to make the same port. They were carried farther down the coast, and when these 2 ships finally landed, and the 300 troops who were in them finally emerged onto shore, they were surrounded by hostile members of the Morini, who no doubt saw the ships as good opportunity for plunder. They ordered the Romans to put down their weapons, if they didn't want to be killed. But the 300 Romans refused. Instead, they formed a circle and defiantly fought off their enemy, which, despite at first being a relatively small band of barbarians, eventually grew to 6,000 men as other barbarian soldiers heard the commotion and joined the fight. For 4 hours, the 300 Romans fought off the 6,000 Morini, all the while receiving only a few wounds and killing several of their enemy. As soon as this was reported to Caesar, he sent all his cavalry to assist the beleaguered Romans. As soon as the cavalry was in sight, the barbarians fled, and many of them were slain. Thus ended Caesar's first invasion of Britain. Ultimately, only 2 nations would send the hostages that Caesar had demanded. The rest refused to do so once Caesar was gone, obviously not expecting Caesar to ever return. But Caesar would return to Britain the following year, and with a much larger force. While Caesar's second invasion of Britain would accomplish more than the first, penetrating inland as far north as the River Thames, and consisting of a series of victories, which culminated in the surrender of the united coalition of barbarian tribes, Caesar would again leave the island without occupying any territory or accumulating any of his accustomed riches, despite levying tribute on the Britons, a tribute that was impossible to enforce since he never returned. The invasions must ultimately therefore have been a financial loss, and the Britons remained independent for nearly another century, until the conquests ordered by the Emperor Claudius in 43 AD. It's not surprising that Caesar's invasions are often, though perhaps carelessly, referred to as failures. It's worth noting that for the Romans themselves, even Caesar's first invasion was worthy of celebration, and the Senate decreed a Thanksgiving of 20 days in honor of Caesar's expedition. Perhaps the ancient biographer Plutarch is best able to express what Caesar's invasions of Britain meant to the Romans of his time, writing, "His expedition against the Britanni was celebrated for its daring, for he was the first to launch a fleet upon the Western Ocean, and to sail through the Atlantic Sea, carrying an army to wage war. The island was of incredible magnitude, and furnished much matter of dispute to multitudes of writers, some of whom claimed that its name and story had been fabricated, since it never had existed and did not then exist. And in his attempt to occupy Britain, he carried the Roman supremacy beyond the confines of the known world."